Okay. All right, so did we knock these out then, or where are we at here?
We're on C.
So mixed is or isn't? Is, right? So we got that going because it lies above. And D, segregation, 100 age, 0 young is not, for just the same reason. The young is above. So we won't get to that point. That won't be a stable spot to be at. Because the young don't want to have or get to there either. And E. So what if we stretch things here and change things up? Some communities have a minimum age for their residents, for example, 50 years old. What is the rationale for minimum age?
Is that like segmenting the age market?
Yeah. Well, yes, kind of, and leading towards segregation. So it's basically by law where we can kind of force the issue and say you can't be in there. So you got some of those old folks communities down in Florida, and there has been age restrictions. It was one touchy area as the law was trying to figure out, is that legal or not, or can you discriminate against old people, or can you discriminate? Another one is against students. So you can have no students allowed. And I remember this at my school. It's, oh, that's not fair, we're being discriminated against. Well, sorry, you're not a protected class, right? So you can discriminate against students. Yeah.
Let's have students.
A big revolt. Time for a revolution.
I mean, I'm pretty sure everyone would be down to be rallying just because they would get them out of class.
Yeah. I was actually thinking about that. Like, what if students went on strike? What would happen?
So,
you'd fail. Yeah, that's what would happen.
They already have your money. They don't care. That's why they.
what do you think? What do you think the rent would be? What do you think the rent would be in this situation if we just passed the law? Yeah. Yeah. Less. Why?
Because there'd be no competition for rent.
Yeah, they're not competing with each other any longer, right? So it would come back, and the rent would effectively be less because part of the process that's going on here is old people and young people bidding to get into the housing.
So would it go all the way down to 50, or would it be somewhere between?
Well, it'd be, yeah, we're kind of eliminating the market forces. By putting in that rule, we're eliminating market forces.
A certain person here wants it to be.
Yeah. All right, so then part E, what if we, what kind of policy, design a policy that would generate an age-segregated community even without explicit age limit?
Social Security, tax on the young.
Okay, a tax.
Transfer to the age, so it effectively shifts the age curve up and shifts.
Do we have to transfer it to the aged?
Not necessarily.
Okay, not necessarily. Chelsea?
Can you, like, I know in some of our other comments they talk about price discrimination and ways like we've seen like senior discounts and stuff like that.
That might be possible too, to lower the age.
Lower rent.
Yeah, to effectively lower it. Anything that gives the aged an edge would probably start to work. How would a tax work here with the young?
It would bring their premium down.
It'd bring it down, yes. So we'd end up going down. Would it go down parallel? Would it go kind of a rotate down? What would that look like? It depends on the style of tax, that's right. So if it's a, what are the two styles? Flat, so if it's per head, and if it would shift down like that, if we do a per head basis, notice we might still get to the point like here, if the tax was here, we might still have a little bit of young in there. But if we make the tax aggressive enough, if we come down to this end point so that the young curve is below the aged everywhere, we get to our segregated outcome by making the tax large enough to do it. Okay? Good. Anything else there?
Would, I guess it doesn't really help the business by any means, but would actually having, if the premium intersection is 20 there, would having that premium be like a maximum, like it can't be equal?
Oh, and you're talking about another policy to have some sort of a
Like
floor of some sort or a ceiling?
Almost a ceiling. So then it's always having the aged wanting to move in versus the young in that sense.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of the mechanism. I mean, you're kind of
I don't know.
you can get in young people. It's kind of essentially talking about a minimum price that the young must pay, which would kind of act like a tax if we can charge them. It would come on the premium side. The premium would be affected by having a flat bar here somewhere. Yeah, something along those lines. Yeah, so any of those policies might be able to get us to that outcome if we're looking to design a policy for segregation. Okay.
Sounds messed up.
It does sound messed up, doesn't it? You know, and so that kind of brings me to my lead-in for this next topic, where we're going to be talking about race. And you guys read the material, you did some of the problems, right? And so, what's the difference between a positive policy and a normative policy, or positive economics in general, and normative economics?
Positive is based on fact, normative is ought or should.
Okay, what ought or should be, right? So sometimes we spend time. Yeah, you nailed that. That was good. So that's probably, honestly, I'm with you on that. I wasn't expecting that somebody would nail it that quick, honestly. So yes, mark this day in history. Max is on the book.
I will take, yeah, 2 balls.
All right, so.
Play your phone out.
Yeah.
So that's important enough to write down, because that's a lot of what we do in economics is on the positive side. So positive versus normative economics. So positive is kind of what is, and normative is what ought, as Max so aptly put it here, what ought to be. All right, so we're making kind of a judgment call here when we get into the normative side. And on the positive side, you know, what is the, like you said, what is the facts? What's the data say? What's the current reality? So we look to data for this. Where traditionally have economists in economic theory spent their time the last 200 years? On the normative side or on the positive side? I spend time on the normative, so you guys might be a little biased. I mean, I like to talk about normative stuff, but it's actually more positive stuff. So some of the history of economic thought is Adam Smith was more on the normative side, and so when economics first got started, I think the vision was what ought to be and how we should design society, and these are the reasons that we should do it that way. And then about the time of David Ricardo, remember he's our comparative advantage, production possibilities frontier guy, things started getting much more positive, like, oh, I've got this figured out. The economy is very mechanistic, right? We can calculate how to do that type of stuff. And to some degree we can, and we use, so there's this balancing act of how we think about the economy and the complexity of it. And for those of you, which, is it all of you? We're in entrepreneurial? Yeah, we spent some time on that, where traditionally we don't have that going on in class, because we've kind of, economists have sculpted the discipline to being very mechanistic. And if we do this, then we do this, kind of like a little computer, a little social computer. And that's just not always the case. And that's why economists tend to have this reputation of being able to be wrong, like weather people. Like, oh, well, that's just what economists do. They're wrong half the time, right?
This is probably a horrible question to ask, but where would Hayek and Keynes be on? Would Hayek be normative?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a loaded question. I think both of them had opinions on what ought to be, but Keynes is definitely on the mechanistic.
I feel like Hayek was also very positive, but he was just, his opinions were different from the generally accepted.
all economists, in general, this is what the discipline's about. All economists, to some degree, are this, because we look at the data. What are the facts? This is the reality. How do we move from point A to point B? So, I'm not trying to say that this is like a big, one versus the other, but I think economists have something to bring to the table on the design of things as well that stray from some of the mechanistic parts. So to kind of get back to this topic, I wanted to bring that up because we look at these issues of segregation and develop a few models on going one direction or the other, and we're not so much making a call on what we think ought to be, but we're just looking at the data and saying, this is what we got. Why? It raises some interesting questions on why are things that way? Do they have to be that way? If we want to change them, how do we go about changing them? Okay, so let me switch over to just a couple slides, and then we're going to jump into that problem. And also bear in mind, are racial segregation and discrimination the same thing?
Desegregation?
No, segregation. I mean, I guess we can look at one side of the coin or the other. Are they the same thing?
Their mechanisms are similar, but they're not necessarily the same thing.
Okay? So that's kind of important to make a distinction in your mind here on what is discrimination versus what is segregation as we're looking at it here from this positive perspective. So what is a segregated outcome?
I see borders.
Okay, there's borders, there's separation, right? We have divisions in place, right? This one goes here, this one goes here. Whether it's income, education, or race, that is segregated. Now, was it a result of discrimination? That's a completely different question, right? So, back prior to 1964, was it a result of discrimination? You betcha, right? Today, is it? I don't know. Probably to a lesser extent. I think we've made great strides in this country to make some differences there. But despite that, we still see it happening. So,
I mean, you go to the cap every day, you see segregation. People segregate themselves by their teams, sometimes by race, sometimes by gender, whatever.
right. So to some degree, there's maybe some human nature. Is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. Where we're going to start in economics class is looking at the data. What are we working with on the positive side? What do we got? And this is some of the data that we have. 2/3 in central cities, 1/3 in suburbs. Reverse that direction for whites. This index of dissimilarity. So what would it take to get to that 50-50 mix is what this index is measuring. And so 64% of one group or the other, doesn't matter who, would have to relocate to kind of get back to this 50-50 mix of whatever demographic we're looking at. And so what's happened over time? Well, 1980 versus 2000, we've seen a decrease in the index. So is that moving towards more segregation or less? Less, right? So that's been the movement over time. And these were some small reductions. So some places tend to, some places have seen increases, some of them have been smaller. So these are looking at just the averages. Just a picture of what we looked at before, I think when we started to go through this. That was Atlanta. And Atlanta is one of the top metropolitan areas in the United States. Pittsburgh. Okay. This is kind of an interesting study, I thought. So 2009, this economist went in and did a survey. I guess I don't know for sure that he's an economist, but it was in the book. Could be a sociology professor as well, or researcher. So what is the ideal neighborhood mix? We've got different answers, but both of them had percentages that were majority, or at least greater than 50%, white. And this was the differences that we had. 19% of whites said it was ideal to have all white. 81% of whites had ideal less than 20. So on average, this graph kind of correlates to what this one's speaking of on the ideal mixes. So let me pause there for a sec. Questions on that data? So the median ideal share, so if we got all these survey respondents, we're going to take the middle person, right? Ordering them from one extreme to the next, take the middle person, and this is what the data kicked out.
So the curves never intersect except for at the origin?
Well, that's part of what we're going to discuss here. So the ideal mix, according to that data, was 67% white, right? And amongst black respondents, and here 87% among white respondents. And so this is neighborhood A, so we're using the same model as before. Now, the way the textbook has this presented, it has it presented with the white premium curve being higher here. Why is that? It's one theoretical possibility, but is there any data that would support that? So the premium curve for white respondents is higher than premium for black respondents. That wouldn't necessarily have to be the case. We could have all these different scenarios where we just did the one on the exercise. It could be a crisscross. It could have been the black one goes up like this and comes down or whatever. Even we could even still have it peaking here, right? So what I'm trying to make a distinction of is that this point where it peaks, according to this data, could have come from different places, but it doesn't necessarily correlate to the rent premium, the rent gap.
You're trying to hit on the fact that if it's fully integrated, obviously you have 50-50, whereas 100% of whites say it's ideal to have no more than 20% black in the community.
13% is what this data said.
Okay.
So it is the premium. But no, I'm trying to think more about why, is there any data that, or anything that you guys can think of why the author put this one above this one?
Median incomes higher.
Incomes are higher. So if we take, again, if we look at the data, the average income among whites is higher than among blacks. It might not be true in every area, by the way, right? So if we're just kind of talking averages. In some areas, that the reverse might be true with income. So that's more of a statistical artifact of dependent upon an area. But on average, that's what we get. And so knowing that data, it seems appropriate to have the premium potentially above. Then the answer is, what outcome does this predict? If that's the case, if the premium's higher and these are the max points, what would this model suggest as far as the equilibrium outcome?
Widely segregated.
Fully segregated. Right? So we see the separation. That's somewhat supported in some of the communities that we saw across Atlanta and these other places.
And the segregation is due to the fact because of the income discrepancies, which means that the blacks cannot afford to live in the
Potentially, or remember that that's only one element of it. Remember we kind of talked about this with the age, or with the what was it?
School.
The schooling, yeah. So depending on how important that is to you, there might be other externalities at play. We don't know all of what shapes their willingness to pay, but certainly one thing would be average income, which might allow them to pay a bit more. Okay. All right. Let's jump into this next problem. Help motivate things a little bit more. So 8, 9. Katie, minus a point for you. Max gets 1. Katie's down 1. Oh, and by the way, I edited it for future. I realized that some of the stuff I was using they changed this figure. The one that you have says 8.5, but it's not exactly this one. So I ended up doing a little cut and pasting. This is the one from your current textbook. It won't make a difference for this problem, but you can see it doesn't have the peaking. It doesn't relate to this data of 2009.